What's going on, everyone? So I am back to talk a little bit more about the 5K that I did a video on yesterday. A lot of you really enjoyed that video, so I appreciate you all checking it out and leaving your comments down below. I want to answer a few of the questions that were asked overall in this video, as well as dive a little bit more into the total breakdown, because PPG was gracious enough to give us these little graphics, which are pretty nicely designed, might I say. Yesterday I had to create my own, breaking down the top 16. So this is pretty cool to see. And we are able to see a total breakdown of what we actually saw in the Swiss rounds and the top 16. And there is a very clear favorite, the top three decks. I'll go into specifics as we have the three kind of lists that we saw in the top 16 of each respective leader. There are some minor differences for sure, some different colors and such, and some more information about everything that went on. So let's not waste any time. Let's dive into it. If you want to pick up any of the cards that you see in any of these deck lists as shown in the video, I have a TCG player link down below. If you use it, helps me out, helps you out. Let's talk about the top 16 a little bit more and the total breakdown. So first off, top 16, we have this where we have 4 Boba Fett, 4 Sabine, 3 Vader, and then a bunch of one-ofs of various different leaders. These 3 have been consistently showing up, not the actual leaders, the style of deck. And I want to talk about this specifically. So if we look and we were to break this down by type of deck, we have 4 tempo decks, what I would consider Boba Fett. You could even include Han a little bit in this one, because this was a strange Han red list, and I would consider that kind of a tempo list. So that's 5 tempo lists where you're more aggressive, leveraging the additional resources you get in the early game to out damage your opponent before your opponent can stabilize with more powerful spells. We had 5 aggro lists in 4 Sabine, 1 Leia. So 5 tempo lists, 5 aggro lists, and then we had 5 control lists, right? 3 Vaders, 1 Palp, 1 Krennic. I will note one of these Vaders was a little bit more on the mid-rangey side. It was a Vader green list, and it did really do some nasty stuff in the Swiss rounds against Boba. Someone who played that list left a comment down below saying they went 3-0 against Boba Fett and really did well against that. So it was a little bit different than the other more controlling lists, the blue-red list that we were seeing. Krennic was a little bit more traditional controlling. And then we had the one of mid-range, like pure mid-range list in Luke. So what we're seeing is I think mid-range is struggling in the format. And I think this is pretty consistent as what we've saw in the past many tournaments that we've seen. And of course, it's reiterating itself here in this top 16. I will say the big difference between this top 16, and we talked a little bit more about the matchups yesterday, is the fact that the control variants are definitely coming to the point where they are control, right? Before, I was a little bit skeptical whenever I was calling Iden control or Krennic control, as they were mainly using just a lot of value cards to get units on the battlefield and trade off with your units and then leverage their more powerful spells in late game. It kind of acted as a mid-range deck despite you playing a lot of controlling cards and trying to heal up and trying to control the battlefield. But what we're seeing now with Vader, especially Vader Blue, is a full control list where you're running, 25, 28 removal spells, and you're really only playing that top end and then maybe a few early game units to potentially smooth out your draws and give you a little bit of card selection, and then leverage the fact that you have Vader as your leader. This is a lot more proactive controlling, in my opinion, and ends up really shaping well against the meta. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing Vader start creeping up more and more. Vader's always been on that like tier 1.5, versus like Boba Fett, Sabine, and that type of deck being tier 1. But I think Vader is actually creeping into tier 1, and I would consider him arguably one of the best decks in the format right now because of the way we're building control and how it shapes up against the other 2 decks in Sabine and Boba. Also to note that one of the Sabine lists was not a traditional Sabine list. It was a Sabine yellow. We talked a little bit more about that, and I'll be going through some of the advantages to that a little bit later on. As for the total breakdown here, we have 37 Boba Fett lists, so very clear favorite here. This is perceived as the absolute strongest deck overall. And I do think in general, the matchups that it has, with the exception of the Vader list, I would say, are very good. Very favorable towards Boba. Vader is unique in that you just have such a powerful leader that can just straight up one-shot Boba. If you're able to get to that point, maybe out ramp or just play the controlling game with things like Entrenched, Super Laser Blast, Boba just cannot really get anything done because it can't leverage the actions that Boba Fett so heavily relies on. One of the reasons why Boba Fett's so strong is that when they play into the more the traditional, mid-rangey control list that we saw in the past tournaments, and when they played against Sabines, Leia's, you're gonna find that they're bouncing your stuff, they're killing their stuff, and they're turning those plays into additional resources to continuously put pressure on you. When you're playing very little units and you're playing all removal spells, what is Boba's action doing? Nothing. It does absolutely nothing. And so I think one of the reasons why Vader Blue is so powerful right now is because Boba Fett is a good matchup for Vader. And that's something that isn't really found in a lot of other decks, which is why when we saw Vader, fighting Boba in the top 16, and even in some of the Swiss rounds, we saw a very favorable win percentage towards Vader in the decks that actually went a little bit deeper into the tournament. Perhaps that's just the players piloting them, but as far as I've found, things like Entrenched, things like Super Laser Blast, things like, Power of the Dark Side, Takedown just really match well into Boba, and not playing any units also really good into Boba. As for, when we're looking into the Sabines, we are still seeing a large portion of the meta dominated by aggro. You can kind of put Leia and Sabine in the same category. If you're to combine those two, you have 36 decks that are very similar, as Leia almost always runs a very similar list to Sabine. One of the big changes or the differences between the two is going to be the General Dodonna, as you can leverage the action cheating to attack with multiple rebels and get benefit from that. Outside of that, you're really seeing a very similar list between the two, and they just do well. Aggro is always going to have a place in basically every single TCG format, and one of the things that makes them so powerful and makes them prevalent in basically any format, with very varying exceptions here and there, is the fact that you can get under and just get down so fast and just damage your opponent so quickly that even if you have a great game plan, even if you have stronger cards, powerful cards, it's just slightly too slow. Vader did really well against this. Again, Entrenched is a key card. I'm going to continue to mention this, and I think I should just do a whole video on some of the key cards that I think are going to go up in price as we start seeing more and more of these tournaments, because people are going to realize how powerful these cards are. But Entrenched on a Sabine, Entrenched on a Leia, Entrenched on a Boba is just so powerful and really hoses those decks. We also saw 15 Idens. Now, a decent chunk of these were Iden Green, and I think that's one of the big things that is weak about the showing of Iden, was the fact that we didn't see the same lists as the Vader list running. And in my opinion, as far as I've seen in the matchups that we have, especially against Boba, I'd much prefer playing Vader Blue over Iden Red, as they are the same color combination and oftentimes the same deck lists. It's just that you're running Vader as your leader versus Iden, because you don't need to be healing. You need to be able to power through your opponent's Boba turns and those crazy turns that they're able to have, and then have the power to dominate and control the board with a stronger leader in Vader, even though it comes down a turn later. It is very powerful. Outside of that, we have a lot of varying different options, a bunch of random, 4-ofs, 3-ofs. I think one of the big sleeper decks, or I guess two big sleeper decks of the breakdown here, is Luke and Han Solo. I think Han Solo is still very strong, and I think that it definitely ends up in that position where if you roll well, then you're going to be able to do well on Han, as it's a very RNG deck compared to a lot of the other things that we're seeing. And Luke, on the other hand, is a very consistent, very mid-range focused deck that actually has some pretty good matchups into a lot of the different things that we're seeing. If you're able to control the field, if you're able to get some early game plays, if you're playing things like Alliance Dispatcher, or just leveraging the fact that you have shield tokens and trying to trade into your opponent's units, it actually does do quite well. And out of all the ones that we see here, I think those two have the most hope, alongside Grand Inquisitor, but that's a little bit of a different aggro style deck. Congrats to Guy, I believe, Guy Cohen. A few of you commented saying, yeah, it's great to see this guy coming back. Or I guess you say he's playing in Star Wars Unlimited because he's playing Flesh and Blood, from what I understand. I do not play Flesh and Blood. It's one of the few trading card games that I didn't really have a ton of interest in. I'm definitely more Magic focused and Star Wars Unlimited. So For those of you that were, happy seeing this guy win, well, he played very well. So congrats to that guy. As for the specific deck list, I want to talk a little bit more about this. We talked about the Vader Blue, and I probably will do a whole video on this, on kind of the list that I've been running, as after seeing a lot of the tournaments and stuff, I've been playing around with the Vader Blue list myself. But we also saw the Boba green list. This is the other two meta decks. I'm going to talk about the Sabine list in just a moment that we saw. This one was Andrew Cox. He was the finalist alongside Guy here. And this list was very, very solid. Very standard list, I would say. I think the biggest difference between this list and anything else that we saw was the 2 copies of Recruit. We don't have the full 3 of Steadfast Battalion. We don't have the full 3 of Cunning, which we see in a lot of lists. But we do have the full 3 of a lot of the standards. Fett's Fire Spray, Bossk, Boba Fett, Darth Vader, Overwhelming Barrage, all standard stuff. One of the key cards, though, was actually Recruit. In a lot of scenarios, able to really give you that card selection. And I was kind of surprised to see this in the list. Another card that is maybe overstated is Resupply. Resupply ends up being a pretty weak card in a lot of matchups. When you're trying to put on pressure and you're ramping, but your opponent is able to disrupt your game plan. Like if you try to play Steadfast Battalion and ECL it out, ECL does nothing against people that are playing full control lists, right? One of the big downsides of ECL is that it has to have a unit to really give that ambush. So you can't ambush out a Steadfast Battalion with ECL and get the benefit if they have no units out. So pretty interesting situation there. The fact that you have Resupply and you're trying to resupply into these really, really massive combo turns kind of is weak when you're not able to ambush things into enemy units. I think ambush is one of the key mechanics that is arguably the strongest mechanic in the entire game. And if you're playing a full control list, you get to bypass all of these, really powerful units, such as Bossk, ECL Steadfast, Darth Vader. All of these cards go so much weaker when you don't actually get the ambush benefit and you're just playing it as the body, right? 5 mana, 5 resource, 4/5 that deals 2 to units, does nothing in the face of Vader. Really, really interesting to see. On the other hand, these are the cards that are exceptionally good against aggro. And as long as aggro is going to be a prevalent deck in the meta, in Sabines, in Leia's, then these cards are going to remain very, very heavy staples in order for you to just dominate that matchup. It's one of the reasons why Boba Green in specific has a good matchup against aggro decks, is it can disrupt their game plan by ambushing out all these units. But again, if you're gonna be in a situation where you are fighting against the Vader Blue list here, I mean, they have what, 3, 6, 8 units below turn, or resource 4, and it's oftentimes that you're not playing it, you're just kind of playing it if it matches up well against your opponent, but you can oftentimes just resource it. And then of course the first real big play is going to be the Lieutenant Childson, and you can't even ambush into this guy. It's going to be a 6/6, it's going to be a 5/5. The only way you have a way to really deal with it is like ECL Steadfast Battalion, but usually if you're going to deploy Boba, it's going to be on like an empty board, because Lieutenant Childson can potentially just kill off your other units, and then you can do things like Power of the Dark Side. You could do things like potentially force choke and deal some extra damage, whatever it is. And even if you are ECLing out a Steadfast Battalion, it's going to die to the Lieutenant Childson, which is one of the things that, well, a lot of other decks don't have that problem, or Boba doesn't have that problem against a lot of their decks. So pretty impressive list. I think it shapes up really good against Boba Green. And then of course we have this is a pretty standard Sabine list. This is one of the top 16 players here, and I was looking through all of them. A lot of them had a little bit poor imaging quality, so I decided to take this one as just a straight up copy here from the top 16. One of the big things I think that's a little bit more interesting about this list than a lot of the other lists that I've seen is we have the 3 copies or 2 copies of R2D2. Now, I have been playing around with R2D2 in a little bit more of a combo centric list, and I do think it's a little bit more interesting as you can really do some nice things with You Are My Only Hope, which is pretty sweet. But we are still seeing, the 3 copies of Steadfast Battalion for ECL targets. We are still seeing, the Fighters for Freedom, Sabine Wrens. I do think one of the things that I'm not convinced about is the Rebel Pathfinders. I know we really want to have a turn 1 play, but we have so many different options, right? I think Rebel Pathfinder's a little bit superfluous, as you don't actually need the additional 2 resource play. At least I found you already have 3, 6, 9, 12 turn 1 plays that cost 2 resources, and then you also have 3 Spec Force Soldier, 2 R2s. I've cut the Rebel Pathfinders from my list personally. I used to run Rebel Pathfinders. I am not a huge fan of it anymore. The chances of you drawing a turn 1 play is, I believe, from the hypergeometric calculator. For those of you that don't know, it's basically just a fancy calculator that allows you to determine draw count or a percentage of you accessing certain draws. Is like 80%. So you have like 80% chance to draw a turn 1 play, and that's not including a mulligan. So you have a very, very, very high chance to have a turn 1 play. And if you don't get it, you're just pretty unlucky. And that's not including the R2s and Spec Force Soldiers, by the way. That's including only the 2 resource plays. And so the Rebel Pathfinder, in some cases, can be a little bit more valuable, but especially in a meta where we're finding ourselves in a lot more controlling, a lot more, mid-rangey started to pop up, more controlling, I would say. Things like Ewing reinforcements become a lot more valuable, and I do like Ewing reinforcements in the main deck. One card that I think is really starting to creep up as a card that's becoming more and more valuable is actually Heroic Sacrifice. This is a card that was actually extremely critical, as there are situations where someone plays Assistant Patrol Craft, a Lieutenant Child Sim, and all you need to do is just get through that card, and Heroic Sacrifice allows you to do that a lot of the times, right? They play Lieutenant Child Sim for 5, and you're like, dang, I cannot get through that. You really need to push damage quickly. Either you have the Spec Force Soldiers, or, you use your Sabine Wren, you Heroic Sacrifice your Sabine Wren in. Yeah, it feels bad. You need to draw a card at least, and you get to attack in for some damage, because that's all your goal is to get in for some damage. And you have the upside of Heroic Sacrificing in your K2SO with Overwhelm and getting in some damage there on the death trigger, which can be quite nice. So I do think Heroic Sacrifice, I like to see the 2 of here. I have been going up to 3, and I've been actually pretty happy with it. And I do like the less Metal Ceremonies, because I think that in the more controlling meta, the Metal Ceremonies go down, as it's hard to leverage the fact that you're attacking with multiple units in a turn, especially with things like Entrenched as a very cheap way to deal with a lot of very powerful threats. You're deploying Sabine so early, a lot of the times it's hard to, deal with it for many decks. Takedown can take it, but if you're past the turn with 4 resources open, a lot of times you just don't deploy Sabine, and that's where something like Entrenched comes into play, as you can kind of fool your opponent. Maybe you just keep the 2 resources you played, I don't know, like an Inferno 4, you get to entrench something. That's quite nice. So really, really exciting there stuff. I very much like to see some modifications here. Heroic Sacrifice, I think that this list is pretty sweet. The sideboard here, we have no heroism units for the most part, except for the Ewing reinforcements. We got 2 copies of Wolf, 3 copies of Disabling Fangfighter, and 3 copies of Consortium Star Viper. So Wolf's pretty interesting, as I'm not convinced on this card. It does get some value, especially against Iden, right? Iden and Krennic are where Wolf comes into play, but I do think we're starting to see a little bit more proactive controlling lists, where the only healing you're really seeing is like Vigilance. And then in the sideboard, they sometimes have like Repair and stuff. We are also signing in like Devotion, but playing out a Wolf in advance, like the way this works is you have to play Wolf the turn that you think your opponent's going to heal, and that prevents you from using your first action to attack. And if you're not attacking with your first action, chances are your opponent's going to deal with that first attack. So yeah, you can't heal, or they can't heal, but you also lost damage from the fact that you couldn't attack straight up. And if you attack first, well, they can oftentimes heal immediately, and so you can't get the Wolf benefit. So I'm not really convinced. I found this was very clunky. On the other hand, Consortium Star Viper, great in the mirror. Very, very strong card, especially if you're ECLing it out. Disabling Fangfighter, also another one that I think is actually getting a little bit more valuable. Again, this is a 3 resource, 3/2, and that might not seem very good, but disabling an upgrade or defeating an upgrade can be really impactful, especially when we're seeing, all the 7th Fleet defenders and the crafty smugglers and that type of stuff. And then Lieutenant Childson, a big game. Just getting 1 less toughness on that unit is oftentimes a difference. Again, difference between 6 toughness on a Lieutenant Shaolin and 5 is huge, as the 3 power units with the heroic sacrifice can actually deal with it in a lot of situations, or you can have yourself, you know, maybe trade in a couple times, and that one less point of power, if they go with a 5 power Lieutenant Shaolin, suddenly your units, potentially like Sabine Leader, doesn't have to die when you trade into it or attack into it, which is pretty sweet. So that this deck list, I think, is pretty standard Sabine green, with the exception of a few cards, which I think is pretty sweet. And overall, I mean, maybe this is kind of repeating myself a little bit. Apologies if I am, but I do think that Boba Fett and Sabine are pretty clear the most favorite, most popular decks. The reason why we're starting to see some other decks creep up and perform quite well is because the meta is not stagnant, because Vader is popping up, but because the meta is predictable, right? We're seeing, if we just look here and we look at the total amount, I think there was 140 players, if I'm not mistaken, 143 players. So 143 players, and we're seeing, what is that? 37. If I just pull up a calculator here, what is that? We pull up a calculator here. 143. 37 divided by 143, 26% of the meta is a large chunk. If you compare that to like Magic numbers, you're looking at like some of the bigger ones, you know, Teamer Rhinos and things like that, or 5 Color Rhinos and Rakdos Scab at the time in the last year. We are approaching like 14% of the meta. So when we're seeing like 26% of the meta be something, and then alongside that, if we include Sabine and Leia, that's another 26% of the meta, right? We know like 50% of the meta is going to be an aggro deck, which we know we can handle, and a tempo deck, which we know we can handle. We have a decent matchup into. Boom, suddenly these decks get a lot better because you have a good matchup for 50% of your matchups. That is absurd, because most of the time you have, you know, a third of it being good matchups, a third of it being, you know, medium matchups, pretty even, and a third of it being bad matchups. But when you play a deck that has good matchups, you're going to find yourself ending up in the top 16 a lot more frequently. Of course, if you're playing the Bobas and you're playing the Sabines, there's a reason why these decks have been dominant. So I do think they aren't like instant losing against Darth Vader, especially Sabine. I think Sabine actually has a better matchup in a Darth Vader than Boba Fett does. But I do find that based on what we've seen from the top 16 and the total breakdown, I think some people are keying into the Boba Fett, the Sabines, and they're starting to figure out stuff. And I do think the very little creature game plan against Boba Fett especially really hinders their game plan. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. I thought this was cool. I thought the graphics were cool, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the tournament because all of you really enjoyed it. And I don't know, I'm just excited. I think it's exciting to talk about this stuff. Tomorrow, I'll probably have a list talking about Vader Blue. Again, my list that I've been kind of messing around with lately. That's obviously based on the top 16. I do think Vader Blue is a little bit stronger than Vader Green, and I personally have found it to be performing better in my testing, but it really depends on matchup, of course. I just think Boba Fett and Sabine in particular, Vader Blue does quite well into, which is kind of surprising, you know? Usually aggro versus control is slightly favorable towards aggro, especially game 1. But we saw Guy just take down everyone 2-0. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, everyone. Use that TCG player link, and I'll see you all for the next one.